Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 6, Sunday, October 8th, 2017. The lesson is entitled God's Covenant with Israel. The lesson comes from Exodus chapter 19, verses 16 through 25. We were asked to read Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 25. The place is Mount Sinai. The time is 1445 BC. Many Christians are familiar with the Ten Commandments. Many believers even know they are found in Exodus 20. But many believers are not as familiar with the context of the giving of the Ten Commandments. In this study, we focus on that context and discover the solemnness and fearfulness of the time preceding the giving of the commandments. Understanding the solemnness and fearfulness heightens the seriousness of this covenant with Israel and of our own relationship with God. Today's aim, facts, to understand the events preceding the giving of the Ten Commandments. Principle, to sense the solemnness and fearfulness of God's covenant with Israel. Application, to have a proper sense of fear and respect in our relationship with the Lord. Illustrating the lesson. Use the illustration to remind your students that we should always approach the Lord with proper fear and respect. Practical points. 1. Christians must prepare themselves every day to meet all-powerful and glory God. Exodus 19:16-17. 2. God chooses to display his glory and power in various ways and at various times. Verse 18. 3. God is holy and powerful beyond our understanding, yet he longs to draw near to his people. Verses 19-20. 4. Our sin separates us from God, but through Christ, God has made a way to approach him. Verse 21. 5. We must remember that our leaders are merely human, so we must resist the tendency to idolize them. Verse 22. 6. Obedience to God is critical for those who lead his people. Verse 23-25. Golden text. Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. Exodus 19-17. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. 1. Assembly, coming from Exodus 19:16-19. 2. Admonition, Exodus 19:20-22. 3. Ascent, Exodus 19:23-25. Assembly, Exodus 19:16. And it came to pass on the 3rd day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. Verse 17. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. Verse 18. At Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it with fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. Verse 19. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. Awesome visitation, Exodus 19:16-17. It had taken the Israelites 3 months to travel from Egypt into the wilderness, where they camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. Verse 1. Although there is some debate concerning the precise location of this mountain, the traditional site of Mount Sinai is in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Since this was the very area where Moses had led his sheep, it was not unfamiliar territory, now leading a different kind of flock. Moses at least knew his way around this desolate region. Sinai was also the place where God had earlier called him to return to the land of his birth, Exodus 3. When Moses ascended the mountain for the first time, God reminded him of both the plagues upon Egypt and Israel's miraculous rescue from slavery. When the Lord bore them on eagle's wings, Exodus 19:4, the Lord promised that if Israel would obey him and keep his covenant, they would be God's peculiar treasure, verse 5, and a kingdom of priests and an holy nation, verse 6. Language later applied to Christians, 1 Peter 2:9. When Moses presented the possibility of Israel being in a covenant relationship with the Lord, the people affirmed their willingness to serve him. And all the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord hath spoken we will do." Exodus 19:8. For the people to enter into this covenant, they needed to be sanctified, that is, set apart. This would be accomplished by washing both their bodies and their clothing, verse 10, and refraining from certain activities, verse 15. Once the people were sanctified, the Lord would come down in the sight of all the people, Exodus 19:11. Although there would be some manifestation of the Lord in their presence, they would not experience God's full glory. Even Moses was not permitted this privilege. As Yahweh later told Moses, "Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live." Exodus 33:20, John 1:18. Moses made sure the people made the necessary preparations for their encounter with God. When the third day arrived, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, Exodus 19:16. As we might expect, all the people that was in the camp trembled. It was no doubt the most awesome event that had ever witnessed. Making their way from the camp to the nether part of the mount, Exodus 19:17, that is the foot of the mountain, the people prepared to meet with God. While the people were assembled at the mountain, restrictions had already been imposed concerning how close they were to get. Verse 12. Breaching this restriction would result in instant death. Verse 13. Reinforcing the solemnity of the occasion. Authoritative voice, Exodus 19:18 through 19. Far from the flippant attitude many modern people have concerning approaching God, the physical manifestations present at their meeting at Mount Sinai stress the sacredness of the occasion. The visible manifestation of fire and smoke, along with the earth literally shaking beneath their feet, should have been enough for the Israelites to realize that they were in the presence of the living God, not one of the imaginary deities of Egypt. This is why it is so surprising that they quickly succumbed to idolatry when Moses ascended the mountain again in the not-too-distant future, chapter 32. As the description of what occurred at Mount Sinai continues, we learn that the voice sound of the trumpet, Exodus 19:16, got louder and louder, verse 19. Whether this was an actual trumpet blast or just a sound like a trumpet, Revelations 4:1, that is what the people of Israel took it to be. The events at Sinai also raised long debated theological issues concerning God's transcendence and immanence. Transcendence is the fact that God is separated from man and above man. God is transcendent in that he is holy and man is sinful. He is transcendent because he is infinite and man is finite. God is holy other than man. Immanence, the opposite of transcendence, describes God's willingness to come to us and to be approached by sinful creatures. The New Testament stresses the truth that God came to us in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John 1:14. While it is true that no man has seen God at any time, John 1:18, he has been revealed to us through his Son, who has provided a new and living way, Hebrews 10:20, for us. We can now draw near, verse 22, to God through our high priest, Jesus Christ. In fact, the Bible says, "Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to find help in time of need." 4:16. While God speaks to us primarily through Scripture, 2 Timothy 3:16, during the church age it can be said that he speaks in other ways as well, such as through trials and tribulations and through the wisdom of the godly. We must nevertheless test everything by God's word. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, 1 John 4:1. While we should be weary of those who claim to hear God's audible voice today, Moses in fact did. Moses spake and God answered him by a voice. Exodus 19:19. In the Gospels, there are only three recorded times God spoke audibly to Christ. Matthew 3:17, 17:5, John 12:28. While there might have been other times the Father spoke audibly to his Son, it seems to have been fair. False prophets, of course, claim divine inspiration. Jeremiah 14:13 through 16, Ezekiel 13:1 through 3, 2 Corinthians 11:13 through 15. Admonition. Verse 20. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount, and the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. Verse 21. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. Verse 22. And let the priests also, who come near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. Solemn charge. Exodus 19:20 through 21. God, of course, is omnipresent, meaning he is present everywhere all the time. This is why David could write, Whither shall I go from the Spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. Psalms 139, 7 through 8. On the other hand, there are times when God is present in a way that is quite different from our usual understanding of the presence of the Lord. Psalms 23:4, Matt 28:20. The awe-inspiring physical manifestations of God's presence at Sinai certainly indicate something extraordinary. The description of the Lord's visitation to earth seems to indicate that he came only as far as the top of Mount Sinai. Moses therefore was called up to the top of the mount. Exodus 19:20. Although Moses was not always quick to obey the Lord, chapters 3 through 4, this time he immediately did what God commanded. So it should be with us. For even Christ, the author of external salvation unto all them that obey him, Hebrews 5:9, had to obey the Father's will, verse 8. Once on top of the mountain, Moses was told to return and charge the people, Exodus 19:21. The word charge also can be rendered warn or admonish. The warning in mind had to do with anyone going beyond the aforementioned boundaries that had been established, verses 12 through 13, in order to gaze, verse 21, upon the Lord. Such actions would bring harsh death. In a dramatic way, God was teaching the people the distance between a holy God and sinful man and woman, as well as the danger of presumptuously rushing into the presence of the Lord. The structure of Old Testament worship emphasized man's sinfulness and God's otherness. The fence around the tabernacle, the veil before the Holy of Holies, the fact that only the priest could minister in the tabernacle and only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, and that but once a year. The emphasis was also keep your distance. Sacred trust, Exodus 19:22. The mention of priest raises the question of the identity of these individuals. Since the Aaronic priesthood had not yet been officially established, we could not be certain who they were. One suggestion is that they were the elders of Israel, Exodus 3:18, men who by virtue of their age and experience were the recognized leaders of the descendants of Jacob. Although another possibility is that they were the young men of the children of Israel, chapter 24, verse 5, who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. Another suggestion is that the firstborn of Israel, chapter 13, verse 2, who were spared during the final plague, functioned as the first priests. Whoever they were, these men had been designated priests, even if it was a temporary arrangement. The point of the priests being singled out, however, was to show that although in a privileged position, they were not to be presumptuous in approaching the Lord. The rules concerning sanctification applied to them as well. Both people and priests had to be careful about keeping their distance from the holy mountain. Sometime later, Aaron's son Nadab and Abihu were struck dead because they disregarded the regulations concerning the fire to be used in worship. Leviticus 10, 1 through 7. God says what he means and means what he says. As Hebrews 10:31 reminds us, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. This is a warning to all people who find themselves in positions of power and authority. It is sad to hear of judges going to jail for breaking the law, physicians addicted to the drugs they were supposed to prescribe to others, or church leaders stealing from the offerings they were to be used for benevolence. People in certain positions may think the rules that apply to others do not apply to them, but this is not true. No one is above God's law. In Israel's case, God's law was about to be given to them in the form of the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, 1 through 17. Ascent, verse 23. And Moses said unto the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for thou chargest us, saying, set bounds about the mount and sanctify it. Verse 24. And the Lord said unto him, away, get thee down, and thou shalt come up, thou and Aaron with thee, but let not the priests and the people break through to come up unto the Lord, lest he break forth unto them. Verse 25. So Moses went down unto the people and spake unto them. Mountain approached. Exodus 19, 23 through 24. Moses had ascended Mount Sinai to be in the presence of God. This would not be the last time he did so. Considering the many regulations, rituals, and rules given Israel concerning their worship and other aspects of being God's chosen people, Moses would have to make many trips to the mountain to receive divine instructions. In response to the Lord's commands in Exodus 19, 21 through 22, Moses reminded the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, verse 23. As we all know, the natural curiosity of humans to see or do things we have never seen or done is always with us. Even if the people had good intentions concerning being in the presence of the Lord, their propensity to evil would have disqualified them from coming into the awesome presence of the Almighty. Moses recalled the Lord's instructions to make sure there was a boundary between the people and the holy mountain. Exactly how this was done is not specifically mentioned. As we know, boundaries of various kinds are necessary. Since we are sinners, we are often tempted to test the moral boundaries God has established. If we will admit it, all of us can recall times we got too close to an alluring temptation and succumbed. On his next trip up the mountain, Moses was told to bring his brother Aaron with him. Aaron had already functioned as Moses' spokesman, Exodus 4, 14 through 16, and now he was about to become the nation's first high priest. As such, it was important for him to be in the presence of the Lord with Moses. Just because Aaron was invited to the mountain did not mean others were free to come as well. Hence Moses was told, "Let not the priests and the people break through to come up unto the Lord," in chapter 19, verse 24. Otherwise, God would be forced to break forth upon them. That is to destroy them. Mediator appointed, Exodus 19:25. While we do not usually think of Moses as a priest, he was, in fact, from the priestly tribe of Levi. Since we do not know who the aforementioned priests, verse 22, were, it is a matter of speculation as to their tribal identity. Functioning as Israel's intermediary, Moses delivered God's message to the people. Later, he interceded on behalf of the people, Exodus 32:30-32, along with being their teacher and lawgiver, bringing to the people God's laws, statutes, ordinances, and decrees was his primary role at this early point in Israel's history. Since the New Testament declares Christians to be a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, and a peculiar people, 1 Peter 2:9, we are to be intermediaries between a holy God and a lost world. As the salt of the earth, Matthew 5:13, and the light of the world, verse 14, we are to let our light shine for Christ, verse 16. Questions. 1. How long did it take the Hebrews to travel from Egypt to Sinai? 2. What important event had occurred earlier at Mount Sinai? 3. What was involved in the sanctification of the people before they met with God? 4. What physical manifestations accompanied the Lord's presence? 5. Why were boundaries set around the mountain? 6. What would be the fate of those who disregarded the restrictions God placed upon them? 7. Who were the priests serving the nation at the time? 8. What lessons can we learn from Israel's experience at Sinai? 9. In what role did Aaron serve, and why was he to come into the Lord's presence? 10. In what way did Moses serve as a mediator between God and Israel? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, October 8th, 2017. Thank you for listening. God bless.